December 17th, 1944, Stalag Luftwaffe, Pomerania. As winter descended upon the Baltic coast, bringing with it the bitter chill that seemed to seep into bones and spirits alike, 300 American airmen huddled in their overcrowded barracks, their bodies thin and worn by months of captivity. They had arrived as proud warriors of the sky, certain that their imprisonment would be brief, that the Allied forces would soon liberate them from German hands. They could not have imagined that their greatest achievement would come not through escape, but through creation. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how 300 men, stripped of freedom and dignity, would transform scraps of hope into an engineering marvel that would not only sustain their bodies, but resurrect their spirits and astonish even their captors. Captain Robert Davison of the 91st Bomb Group stared at the thin gruel that passed for breakfast. The watery soup containing no more than 700 calories, barely a quarter of what a healthy adult male required. At 6'1", Davison had already lost nearly 40 pounds since being shot down over Hamburg 4 months prior. His B-17 Flying Fortress, Liberty Bell, had been his home in the skies until flak tore through the right wing, sending the massive 4-engine bomber into an unrecoverable spin. 3 of his crew had perished. The survivors, including Davison, had parachuted into captivity. "We can't keep going like this," Davison muttered to Technical Sergeant Walter Conants, who shared his bunk space. "The Red Cross parcels aren't getting through anymore. The Germans are claiming transportation difficulties." "Transportation difficulties," Conants scoffed, his voice carrying the distinctive twang of Oklahoma. "More like they're losing on all fronts and decided we should starve along with them." Lieutenant Colonel John Hardin, the highest-ranking American officer in their compound, approached their table in the mess hall. At 52, Hardin was considerably older than most of the airmen. His silver hair and weathered face had earned him the nickname, the Old Man, though the respect in which it was spoken removed any sting from the moniker. "Gentlemen," Hardin said, his voice low enough that the German guards stationed by the doors couldn't hear, "meeting in Barracks 7 tonight, senior officers and anyone with engineering experience." "Engineering experience, sir?" Davison asked. "Yes, Captain. I believe it's time we did something about our situation." That evening, 30 men crowded into the small space between bunks in Barracks 7. They represented a cross-section of American ingenuity, former factory workers, mechanics, a structural engineer from Detroit, 2 agriculture students, and even a chemistry professor from MIT. Lieutenant Colonel Hardin stood in the center of the group. "Gentlemen, winter is here, and it's going to be a long one. Intelligence suggests the war might not end until mid to late 45. The German rations are insufficient, and we cannot count on Red Cross packages. We need to supplement our food supply." "With all due respect, sir," said First Lieutenant Merrill Jenkins, a navigator from the 8th Air Force, "where exactly are we going to get food? We're behind barbed wire, watched by machine guns in towers." "We're going to grow it," Hardin replied simply. The room fell silent. Then came the murmurs of disbelief. "Grow food in winter in Poland?" Sergeant Frank Osborne from Texas couldn't hide his skepticism. "Sir, I grew up on a farm, and I'm telling you, nothing grows in frozen ground." "Not in the ground, Sergeant. Inside." Staff Sergeant Benjamin Miller, formerly a civil engineering student at Cornell University before the war called him to service, stepped forward. "Hydroponics," he said, nodding slowly. "Growing plants without soil, using mineral nutrient solutions in water." "Precisely, Sergeant Miller," Hardin confirmed. "Before my military career, I worked with the Department of Agriculture. Hydroponics was an emerging field. The Japanese have been developing techniques for decades, and our own military has experimental hydroponic gardens on some Pacific islands where soil is poor." Captain Ernst Müller, a Wehrmacht officer responsible for the camp's security, observed the Americans with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. At 43, Müller was a veteran of both World Wars, having served as a young soldier on the Western Front in 1918. Unlike many of his colleagues, he adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention's rules regarding treatment of prisoners. Not out of any particular affection for the enemy, but because Müller was, above all things, a man who believed in order. "They're planning something," Müller remarked to Hauptmann Weber, his second-in-command. "The Americans in Compound C have been too quiet." "Escape tunnel?" Weber suggested, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. The result of 3 years on the Eastern Front before a Soviet bullet through his lung had rendered him unfit for frontline service. "No, their senior officers are involved. They know the consequences of escape attempts, and besides, where would they go? The Russians are advancing from the east, but they're still hundreds of kilometers away. No, it's something else." "Perhaps we should increase searches," Weber offered. "Yes, but discreetly. I want to know what they're planning before we intervene." The next morning, Lieutenant Michael Pearson, a chemical engineer from Massachusetts who had flown 23 bombing missions before his capture, addressed the growing committee. "Our biggest challenges are light, nutrients, containers, and heating," Pearson explained. "Plants need at least 6 hours of quality light daily. German winters average only 8 hours of daylight, much of it weak, and we're not exactly allowed to stroll outside at our leisure." Technical Sergeant Daniel Foster, who had worked for General Electric before the war, spoke up. "We can build reflectors from the tin in our food cans. If we position them strategically near the windows, we can amplify whatever sunlight we get. We'll also need artificial light," added Staff Sergeant Walter Kimball, who had been an electrician in civilian life. "I've been studying the camp's electrical system. Each barracks has limited power for basic lighting. If we create a minor short circuit in the main junction box, the Germans will have to send an electrician. While they're fixing it, I can tap into the line and divert additional current." "That's risky," Hardin warned. "Everything about this is risky, sir," Kimball replied, "but I can do it without being detected." The most pressing challenge remained containers and growing medium. With no access to conventional gardening supplies, the men would need to improvise. Master Sergeant Vincent Lombardi, a stocky Italian-American from Brooklyn who had served as a mess sergeant before being assigned as a waist gunner on a B-24 Liberator, had a suggestion. "The Red Cross boxes, the wooden ones. We can break them down and rebuild them as troughs. Line them with the wax paper from our cigarette packs to make them waterproof." "And what do we use for growing medium?" asked Flight Officer Thomas Spencer, whose Tennessee drawl remained thick despite 8 months in captivity. Professor Harold Wilson, the chemistry teacher from MIT who had joined the Army Air Forces at 45 and served as a bombardier, cleared his throat. "Sand, charcoal and small gravel, all of which we can gather from the compound during exercise periods. The Germans won't notice if each man pockets a handful daily." "And nutrients?" Davison inquired. Wilson's expression grew serious. "That's the most difficult part. Plants need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and various micronutrients. We can extract some from our own waste, though it's not a pleasant topic for discussion." "Our waste?" echoed Sergeant Raymond Peterson, looking queasy. "Urine, specifically," Wilson clarified. "It contains nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, the 3 primary nutrients plants require. We'll need to dilute it significantly, of course, and ideally age it to break down the urea." Sergeant Frank Osborne, the farm boy from Texas, nodded in agreement. "He's right. Old-timers back home used diluted urine as fertilizer during hard times. They called it night water." "We'll also need to collect any eggshells, fish bones, or meat bones from our rations," Wilson continued. "They can be crushed and added for calcium." For the next 3 weeks, the men worked in shifts. Those with engineering expertise designed the growing systems, others collected materials. Cigarette packs were carefully disassembled for their wax paper. Red Cross box wood was salvaged and split into thin slats. Tin cans were flattened and polished to create reflectors. Sergeant Kimball successfully tapped into the camp's electrical system during a scheduled maintenance call, creating a separate circuit that would power small light bulbs salvaged from damaged fixtures throughout the camp. The Germans noticed the increased activity but remained uncertain of its purpose. Captain Muller observed the Americans during his daily inspections, noting how they suddenly fell silent when he approached. "They've been collecting things," Weber reported. "Pebbles, bits of charcoal from the stoves, empty cans." "Weapons?" Muller asked. "No, sir. Nothing that could be fashioned into a weapon. Continue observation, but do not interfere yet. If they were planning violence or escape, they would be more secretive. This seems different." By mid-January, the first prototype was ready. In a corner of Barracks 3, beneath a bunk, the men installed a wooden trough measuring 6 feet long by 2 feet wide. The bottom was lined with cigarette pack wax paper, carefully melted together at the seams. Inside, a mixture of sand, crushed charcoal, and small gravel formed the growing medium. Above, a system of tin reflectors directed the meager winter sunlight from the nearest window, supplemented by 3 light bulbs that glowed for 8 hours each night, powered by the diverted electricity. The nutrient solution was the most challenging aspect. For weeks, selected men had been collecting their urine in empty condensed milk cans, storing the liquid in covered buckets behind the latrines to age. Professor Wilson mixed this with water at a 20:1 ratio, added crushed eggshells saved from the kitchen, and a small amount of wood ash from the stoves for potassium. "What are we growing?" asked Corporal James Williams, one of the youngest prisoners at barely 20 years old. "Radishes and lettuce to start," Professor Wilson explained. "They grow quickly. Some varieties of radish can be harvested in as little as 3 weeks. Fast growth means faster nutrition for us." "Can 300 men survive on lettuce and radishes?" Davison wondered aloud. "This is just the beginning," Hardin assured him. "If this works, we scale up. Every barracks becomes a growing station. We add more nutrient-dense crops as we refine the system." On January 28, 1944, they planted their first seeds, radish and lettuce varieties that had been carefully extracted from the dried vegetables occasionally included in their rations. Some men had even recovered seeds from the cores of apples that rarely appeared in Red Cross parcels. The waiting began. Captain Mueller finally discovered the operation during a surprise night inspection in early February. He stood silently at the end of Barracks 3, watching as Sergeants Foster and Kimball adjusted the light reflectors above what was unmistakably a garden. "Explain this," Mueller demanded, causing both Americans to jolt in surprise. Hardin was summoned. He arrived quickly, his face expressionless as he faced the German officer. "Hydroponics, Captain Mueller. We are growing food." Mueller studied the elaborate setup with undisguised astonishment. "This is unexpected." "We are slowly starving," Hardin stated matter-of-factly. "The rations are insufficient. The Geneva Convention stipulates—" Mueller raised a hand to stop him. "I am aware of the convention, Colonel. I am also aware of the reality of Germany's situation. There is barely enough food for our own soldiers and civilians." He leaned closer to examine the tiny green shoots that had begun to emerge from the growing medium. "You created this. From nothing." "From what we could find," Hardin corrected. "Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say." Mueller straightened, his face unreadable. "I should report this unauthorized use of electricity and materials." "You could," Hardin acknowledged. "Or you could recognize that healthier prisoners require less medical attention, create fewer problems, and reflect better on those responsible for their care." A long moment passed between the two officers. "I will need to inform Commandant Brauer," Muller finally said. "But I will recommend that the project be allowed to continue as an experiment. Scientific advancement benefits all nations, does it not?" 3 days later, Commandant Brauer himself visited the barracks. A career military man with a rigid adherence to protocol, Brauer was nonetheless pragmatic. After inspecting the hydroponic system and listening to Professor Wilson's detailed explanation of the science involved, the commandant made his decision. "You may continue with this project," he announced. "However, it must be properly documented as a scientific experiment. Captain Muller will oversee and record your progress. Any attempt to use these materials for other purposes will result in severe consequences." What the Americans hadn't anticipated was the genuine interest their project would generate among some of the German staff. Hauptmann Weber, who had grown up on a farm in Bavaria, became particularly fascinated. "My father would have called this witchcraft," Weber remarked to Professor Wilson during one inspection. "Growing plants without soil?" "It's simply science, Captain," Wilson replied. "The soil itself doesn't feed plants. It merely holds nutrients in a form they can absorb. We're providing those nutrients directly." News of the American garden spread throughout the camp. Soon, prisoners from other compounds requested information. Captain Davison organized training sessions, teaching representatives from British, Canadian, and French compounds how to construct their own systems. By March, the first harvest was ready. The radishes were small, but vibrant red. The lettuce leaves were tender and green, a shocking contrast to the drab greys and browns of prison life. Divided among the men of Barracks 3, each received only a few bites, but the psychological impact far outweighed the nutritional benefit. "I'd forgotten what fresh food tastes like," Technical Sergeant Conant said, savoring a small radish as if it were a gourmet meal. The success prompted rapid expansion, with tacit German approval, motivated in part by their own scientific curiosity and in part by the practical benefits of healthier prisoners. The Americans built additional systems in every barracks. They refined their techniques, improved the nutrient solutions, and diversified their crops. By April, they were growing carrots, more varieties of lettuce, spinach, and even small tomato plants, started from seeds carefully extracted from the occasional tomato that appeared in their rations. The compounds began to transform, with growing systems appearing beneath bunks, along walls, and in every available space. Captain Muller found himself increasingly impressed by American ingenuity. During one inspection, he brought along Dr. Klaus Schmidt, a botanist from the nearby University of Greifswald, who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht as a medical officer. "Remarkable," Schmidt commented, examining the nutrient delivery system created entirely from salvaged materials. "The Reich has experimental hydroponic facilities, but nothing improvised like this. We've spent millions of Reichsmarks on research that these prisoners have essentially duplicated with garbage." The irony wasn't lost on Muller. "They are very resourceful." "This could be valuable information," Schmidt suggested, "for after the war." Muller nodded, understanding the implication. By spring of 1944, few educated Germans still believed in ultimate victory. Many were already considering how to survive the aftermath. As May arrived, the expanding operation faced new challenges. The increased electrical usage had not gone unnoticed by camp administrators. Commandant Brauer summoned Hardin and Muller to his office. "The camp is exceeding its electrical allotment by 30%, Brauer stated coldly. "Berlin has noticed and demanded an explanation." Muller stood at attention. "Herr Kommandant, I have documented the agricultural experiment as a scientific project of potential value to the Reich. The knowledge gained could help address food shortages." Brauer considered this. And you believe this justifies the resource expenditure? I do, Herr Commandant. Additionally, the improved nutrition has reduced sick call visits by 22%, saving medical supplies. After a long pause, Brower nodded. Very well. I will report it as an authorized scientific project, but there will be no further expansion without direct approval. By June, the hydroponic systems were producing enough fresh vegetables to supplement each prisoner's diet with small but meaningful portions 3 times weekly. The health benefits became increasingly evident. Fewer cases of scurvy and other deficiency diseases, improved morale, and even better resistance to the respiratory infections that had previously swept through the crowded barracks regularly. Lieutenant Michael Pearson, the chemical engineer, continued refining their nutrient solutions. Working with Professor Wilson, he developed a method to extract additional minerals from crushed eggshells, fish bones, and even the leather from worn-out boots. The calcium content is critical, Pearson explained to a group of interested prisoners. Without it, the cell walls of the plants weaken, leading to blossom end rot in fruiting plants like our tomatoes. Some of the guards began bringing coffee grounds from the officers' mess, ostensibly to dispose of, but clearly intended to contribute to the nutrient mix after learning from Professor Wilson that coffee grounds provided nitrogen and other minerals beneficial to plants. Captain Mueller maintained his professional distance, but his fascination with the project was evident in the detailed notes he kept. One evening, he approached Hardin with an unusual request. "Colonel, my family owns a small farm near Munich. After the war..." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Would it be possible to have information about these techniques sent to that address?" Hardin studied the German officer's face. "You believe Germany will lose then?" Muller's expression remained carefully neutral. "I believe in preparing for all possibilities, and I believe knowledge transcends conflicts between nations. I'll make sure the information reaches your family," Hardin promised. In July 1944, as news of the Allied invasion of Normandy filtered into the camp, the hydroponic project achieved a new milestone. The first tomatoes ripened, small cherry varieties, but bursting with flavor and precious vitamins. The system had expanded to include vertical growing techniques, with tomato vines trained upward along strings to maximize the limited space. Technical Sergeant Daniel Foster, applying his engineering expertise, had developed a passive water circulation system using differences in temperature to move nutrient solution without pumps. The design allowed them to grow watercress directly in flowing nutrient solution, adding another nutritious green to their supplemental diet. By August, the project had grown to occupy over 3,000 square feet of growing space distributed throughout the American compound. Over 24 different edible plants were in various stages of growth, carefully tended by prisoners who had organized themselves into specialized teams. The nutrient squad, responsible for mixing and distributing the growing solutions, the maintenance crew, who repaired and improved the growing containers, and the harvesting team, who collected and evenly distributed the precious produce. The ingenuity extended beyond merely growing food. Sergeant Frank Osborne, the Texas farm boy, had adapted traditional companion planting techniques to their hydroponic systems, placing certain plants together to repel insects or enhance growth. He had even developed a rudimentary biological pest control by collecting and breeding ladybugs found in the exercise yard to control aphids that occasionally infested their plants. "My grandma would be mighty surprised," Osborne remarked. "She taught me all about which plants grow well together in soil. Turns out some of the same principles work even without dirt." The word of the Americans' success spread beyond Stalag Luft 4. In September, officers from other POW camps were brought to observe the operation. German agricultural officials, increasingly concerned about food security as Allied bombs devastated the Reich's transportation infrastructure, took careful notes and photographs. For the Americans, the project had become far more than a source of supplemental nutrition. It represented hope, purpose, and a powerful assertion of life in the midst of captivity. Men who had previously spent hours staring vacantly at barracks walls now debated the merits of different nutrient mixtures or proudly displayed particularly successful plants to their comrades. When I was shot down, I thought my contribution to the war effort was over, Captain Davison confided to Colonel Hardin as they inspected a particularly productive tomato system in Barracks 8. Now I wonder if what we're learning here might not be more important in the long run than another bombing mission would have been. Hardin nodded thoughtfully. Wars end, Captain. Hunger is eternal. If these techniques can be refined and implemented elsewhere. He left the thought unfinished. In October, as the distant thunder of artillery became occasionally audible from the east, a reminder of the advancing Soviet forces, Commandant Brauer made a surprising announcement. The camp's hydroponic project was to be documented in a formal report commissioned by the Ministry of Agriculture. Professor Wilson and Lieutenant Pearson were tasked with writing detailed instructions, with Captain Mueller translating. "They're preparing for after the war," Hardin observed privately to his officers. "The Germans know it's ending, and not in their favor. They're salvaging what knowledge they can." As winter approached again, bringing with it new challenges for maintaining adequate temperature and light for the plants, the men faced an unexpected dilemma. Intelligence suggested the Germans might evacuate the camp if Soviet forces continued their advance, forcing the prisoners on a winter march westward ahead of the Russian army. "We can't abandon all this," Foster insisted during a meeting of the project leaders. "We've created something that could help address hunger worldwide after the war." Professor Wilson nodded agreement. "The documentation Muller is translating will preserve the technical knowledge, but there's something about seeing these systems in operation, the practical applications we've developed through trial and error, that can't be fully captured in writing." After much debate, a plan was formed. Selected seeds from their most successful plant varieties were carefully dried and packaged in small paper envelopes made from cigarette packs. These were distributed among the men with instructions to conceal them in clothing seams, hollow boot heels, or other hidden locations that might survive a forced march. The key engineers and botanists memorized crucial aspects of the designs and techniques, each becoming a repository for a portion of their collective knowledge. In December 1944, exactly 1 year after the project's conception, the hydroponic systems of Stalag Luft 4 were producing nearly 200 pounds of fresh vegetables weekly, enough to provide each American prisoner with a small but significant nutritional supplement every other day. Cases of nutritional deficiency diseases had dropped by over 80% compared to the previous winter. On Christmas Eve, Captain Mueller visited Barracks 3, where the original prototype had been built. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Colonel Hardin," Mueller said formally, "with Commandant Brauer's permission, I have brought something for your men." He unwrapped the package to reveal several small packets of seeds. "These are cold-resistant spinach and kale varieties from my family's farm. They may prove useful in the remaining winter months." The gesture wasn't lost on Hardin. "Thank you, Captain. This is most generous." Mueller lowered his voice. "The documentation is complete. Copies have been sent to agricultural ministries in Switzerland and Sweden as well. Neutral countries," Hardin noted, "places where the information would survive, regardless of how the war ended." Mueller continued, even quieter. "You should prepare your men, Colonel. If the eastern situation deteriorates further, there may be movements ordered." "I understand," Hardin replied. On January 29, 1945, the order came. With Soviet forces approaching from the east, Stalag Luft IV was to be evacuated. The prisoners were given 6 hours to prepare for a march westward in the bitter Polish winter. In those final hours, the men harvested everything edible from their growing systems. What couldn't be consumed immediately was preserved as best possible, wrapped in damp cloth for the journey. The most successful seed varieties were distributed among additional men, hidden in clothing and personal items. Before departing, Professor Wilson and Captain Muller made a final inspection of the hydroponic systems that had sustained hundreds of men through months of captivity. "It seems a shame to abandon all this," Wilson remarked. "It is not abandoned," Muller replied. "What was built here continues." He tapped his temple. In mind, then his chest, and here. As the column of prisoners marched out through the main gate of Stalag Luft IV on January 30th, Captain Robert Davison took a final look back at the compound where 300 American airmen had created an agricultural marvel from scraps and determination. "We came here as warriors," he said to Technical Sergeant Conants beside him. "Who would have thought we'd leave as farmers?" And the knowledge did indeed survive. After liberation, members of the Stalag Luft IV hydroponics project were debriefed by Allied agricultural experts. Their techniques, refined under the harshest conditions imaginable, contributed to post-war food production innovations in Europe, the Philippines and Japan, where traditional agriculture had been devastated by the conflict. Captain Muller's family farm outside Munich eventually became a teaching center for modern agricultural methods, including hydroponics in the 1950s. The seed varieties developed and preserved by the American POWs, selected for their ability to thrive under minimal light and challenging conditions, became particularly valuable for early space program research into sustaining astronauts on long-duration missions. Colonel Hardin would later testify before a Congressional Agricultural Committee in 1947. What began as a desperate attempt to supplement starvation rations became something far more profound. In creating those hydroponic gardens, we rediscovered a fundamental truth about humanity. The power to create is stronger than any power to destroy. Today, some of the techniques pioneered by those 300 American POWs form the foundation of vertical farming technologies and urban agriculture systems that feed millions in space-constrained cities worldwide. Their innovation, born of desperation and ingenuity, continues to bloom in unexpected places, a living memorial to the human capacity for creation even in the darkest circumstances. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.